He was a 6'8", 300-pound monster who terrified thousands. He was also an intellectual who sat in the locker room, chain in hand, calmly reading the Wall Street Journal. Frank Goodish built his entire career on one principle: invincibility. His creation, the monster Bruiser Brody, was a brand he protected by refusing to lose. This strategy made him one of the highest-paid independent stars in the world. But in a final tragic irony, that fortress of invincibility became his tomb. When he was stabbed to death, that same terrifying reputation was the exact alibi his killer used in court to walk free. This is the story of Bruiser Brody. How does a man's greatest asset become the perfect excuse for his own murder? Frank Donald Goodish was born on June 14, 1946, in Detroit, Michigan. He was the product of a post-war working-class America. His father was a factory worker, a man who built a life on grit and resilience. This tough blue-collar foundation was not just a birthplace, it was a mindset. It was the first brick laid in the complex, self-reliant fortress the man would become. When the family relocated from the industrial hive of Detroit to the wide-open, high-desert landscape of Albuquerque, New Mexico, Frank brought that Detroit toughness with him. But it was in Albuquerque that he forged his independence. From a young age, it was clear he was a physical prodigy. He wasn't just a big kid, he was a superior athlete. He moved with a speed and coordination that defied his size. By age 16, he stood 6'5", a giant at Highland High School, and a legend in the local sports pages. He was an all-state star in both basketball and football, but the gridiron was his true calling. As a defensive end, he was a force of nature, a legitimate prospect with a future that seemed preordained. His talent was his ticket out. It earned him a scholarship to a major program, Iowa State University, where he played from 1964 to 1965. But for reasons of personality or fit, he didn't stay. He transferred to West Texas State, a university that, unbeknownst to him, was a hothouse, a pipeline for future wrestling legends. From 1966 to 1968, he was a dominant offensive and defensive lineman. He wasn't just a big body on the line, he was a star. He played alongside other future stars like Tito Santana and Ted DiBiase. He was good, so good that in 1967, he was named to the All-Missouri Valley Conference team. The dream was clear, logical, and seemingly inevitable: the NFL. In 1968, the dream came true. He was drafted in the 10th round by the Washington Redskins. But this is where the idyllic story ends, and the story of Bruiser Brody truly begins. Professional sports are a brutal, cold, and impersonal business. A severe knee injury shattered his chances before they ever began. He was 22 years old, a 10th-round pick, expendable. He was cut. The path he had walked his entire life had just vanished from under his feet. He tried again, fueled by that Detroit grit. He tried out for the Houston Oilers in 1969. He tried for the St. Louis Cardinals. The dream was dead. It is impossible to overstate the importance of this moment. This failure, this rejection is the psychological key to understanding the man he would become. At 23, Frank Goodish learned a lesson that would scar him for life. He learned that talent, hard work, and loyalty meant nothing to promoters in a suit. He learned that he was a product, a piece of meat that could be, and would be, discarded the second it was damaged. This rejection is the genesis of Bruiser Brody. It is the birthplace of his famous distrust, his cash-up-front mentality, and his obsessive need to protect his own value. He vowed in that moment that no one would ever have that kind of power over him again. With his athletic career in ruins, Frank Goodish had to reinvent himself. And his next move reveals everything about the man behind the monster. He didn't drift. He didn't wallow. He was a man of focus and responsibility. He had married his wife, Barbara Smith, in 1968. He had a family to build. And so the 6'8", 300-pound failed football player did something that defies the monster image. From 1970 to 1972, he became a sports journalist for the Albuquerque Journal. Think about that. The man who would become famous for primal screams and incoherent rage was, in reality, educated, articulate, and analytical. This wasn't just a job. It was an education. He wasn't an athlete in the game anymore. He was a professional observer of the game. He learned to dissect the business of sports, the promotion, the contracts, the personalities, the kayfabe of the front office. He was training his mind to be as sharp and dangerous as his body. But a desk job couldn't pay all the bills, nor could it contain his sheer physical presence. He put his body to work, and in doing so, he gathered the final pieces of his future persona. He became a bouncer in New Mexico bars, learning the stark, practical reality of violence, control, and intimidation. He wasn't running a play. He was learning how to command a room, how to project an aura of danger that could end a fight before it started. Simultaneously, he entered and won local bodybuilding contests, learning how to sculpt and present his physique not just as functional, but as a larger-than-life superhuman attraction. This was the perfect storm. By 1973, Frank Goodish was a new man. He possessed a legitimate all-conference athletic pedigree. He had the real-world toughness and applied intimidation of a bouncer. He had the sculpted visual shock value physique of a bodybuilder. And most importantly, he had the sharp, analytical, and deeply cynical mind of a journalist who had been chewed up and spit out by the system. He looked at the world of professional wrestling, at the godlike status of Texas legends like Fritz von Erich, and he didn't see a last resort. He saw a target. He saw a flawed, exploitative industry run by promoters he already distrusted, populated by athletes he knew he was tougher than. It was a calculated business decision. In 1973, he drove to Florida to train under the legendary Eddie Graham. He debuted as Frank Goodish, but the persona was quickly crafted. He became King Kong Brody. The fur boots, the wild hair, the steel chain. It was an image of pure, untamed savagery. The name was soon refined to Bruiser Brody. The man Frank Goodish had just created his greatest asset, the brand. He was an immediate sensation. His size, his legitimate athletic background, and his terrifying, believable intensity made him an instant main event draw. He was booked in the WWF against the Ultimate Champion, Bruno Sammartino, at Madison Square Garden. He toured all the major NWA territories, including his future home base in Texas. But from the very beginning, this was different. The promoters weren't dealing with just another big, simple-minded monster they could use up and discard. They were dealing with Frank Goodish, the journalist and the businessman. He understood his value from day one. He knew, with the clarity of a man who had already lost everything, that the invincibility of Bruiser Brody was the only product he had to sell. And he would protect that product, that brand, that monster, at all costs. This decision would make him a legend. It would also make him powerful enemies and ultimately seal his fate. Frank Goodish viewed his creation, Bruiser Brody, not as a character, but as a corporation. It was a one-man multinational enterprise, and he was its CEO, COO, and sole shareholder. In the brutal nomadic ecosystem of 1970s and 80s, professional wrestling, an industry of handshake deals, cash-in-hand payoffs, and ruthless exploitation, Frank Goodish was a revolutionary. He was a corporation that had infiltrated a world of carnies, and his entire corporate philosophy was built on one indestructible product: invincibility. In his mind, a monster who could be beaten was no longer a monster. It was just a big man in a costume. And a monster who wasn't special didn't sell tickets. This core philosophy, forged in the rejection rooms of the NFL, dictated every decision he made. It was a philosophy that would make him a legend, make him a wealthy man, and set him on a direct, fatal collision course with the industry's old guard. To protect his product, he employed two primary tactics. Both were considered by the standards of the day to be the ultimate sins. The first was simple but infuriating. He would just say no. Promoters, especially in the regional territories, had a simple formula: bring in a terrifying monster, feed him a series of local overmatched opponents for weeks to build his aura, and then have him do the job to the local beloved hero. This would pop a huge crowd, send the fans home happy, and reestablish the local hero's dominance. Frank Goodish looked at this model and saw it for what it was: a pump and dump scheme. The promoter was getting a one-night-only jackpot by cashing in and destroying the one thing Brody had to sell: his aura. When a promoter would present a finish where Brody was to lose, they were often met with a flat refusal. To the promoters, this was heresy. It was a flagrant violation of the unwritten rules of the locker room, a code of going along to get along. To Frank, it was simply quality control. His second, more surgical tactic was the no sell. This was his in-ring political weapon. If an opponent he deemed unworthy, someone green, or someone he didn't respect professionally, hit him with their best shot, Brody wouldn't just flinch. He wouldn't just kick out at the 2 count. He would do nothing. He'd just stand there as if hit by a fly and stare at them with those wild eyes. This was an act of profound public humiliation. In that single moment, Brody was communicating non-verbally to every single person in the building. This man cannot hurt me. Your hero is a fraud. The entire premise of this contest is a lie. It made his opponent look weak. It made the promoter who booked the match look foolish. And it made Bruiser Brody look superhuman. It was, by the standards of the craft, unprofessional in the highest degree. And it was a brilliant, ruthless business move. This behavior, this complete disregard for the established hierarchy, would have gotten any other wrestler blackballed from the industry. Promoters would have conspired to keep him unemployed, to starve him out until he learned to play by the rules. But Bruiser Brody could not be blackballed. He had an ace up his sleeve, a golden parachute that made him untouchable: Japan. In 1979, when Brody first toured All Japan Pro Wrestling, he found his artistic and financial home. The Japanese audience was not the American audience. They didn't want a simple morality play of good versus evil. They valued tokon, or fighting spirit. They wanted to believe what they were watching was a real fight. Brody's chaotic, chain-swinging, stiff-hitting, crowd-brawling style was seen as authentically terrifying. When he no-sold a vicious chop from a Japanese legend, the Tokyo crowd at Budokan Hall didn't see an uncooperative performer. They saw an impossibly tough man. He, more than anyone, delivered the realism they craved. He found his perfect partner there, his fellow West Texas State alumnus, the equally terrifying Stan the Lariat Hansen. Hansen was a 300-pound force of nature, famously nearsighted, who would just charge, roaring, and swing his arm in a clothesline that could, and often did, legitimately knock men unconscious. When Giant Baba, the promoter of AJPW, had the genius to team them up, they became the Miracle Power combination. They were arguably the most feared and successful foreign tag team in Japanese wrestling history. Their matches against legends like Giant Baba, Jumbo Tsuruta, and their American rivals, the Funk Brothers, were not wrestling matches. They were ticket-selling riots. They were two massive, uncontrollable American cowboys, and the Japanese audience, who valued order and politeness in their daily lives, paid a fortune to see them create pure, unadulterated chaos. This massive guaranteed income from Japan, where he was paid like a major U.S. sports star, gave Brody the ultimate leverage. He was financially independent of the American system. He didn't need the American promoters. They needed him. This leverage created the legend of his difficult reputation. He would demand his pay in cash up front before he would even lace his boots. Promoters tell stories with lingering bitterness of Brody arriving at the arena just minutes before the main event, giving them a heart attack. This wasn't because he was late. It was a power play. It was to ensure the promoter couldn't corner him and change the deal at the last minute. He would negotiate his finishes, his jobs like a high-stakes corporate lawyer. "You want me to lose to him tonight?" he would ask. "Fine. That'll devalue me for the next territory. So you're not paying me for one match tonight. You're paying me for damaging my business for the next 6 months. The price is double." His relationship with Fritz von Erich in Dallas at World Class Championship Wrestling was a perfect example. Fritz, a notoriously frugal and dominant promoter, a patriarch who demanded loyalty, reportedly despised Brody's mercenary tactics. But he couldn't argue with the results. When Brody was on the card, set to brawl with one of the beloved von Erich sons, the Dallas Sportatorium was sold out. Brody was the perfect dragon for the von Erich heroes to slay, and he made Fritz pay dearly in cash every single time. This duality defined him. This is where the Wall Street Journal anecdote becomes so vital. Other wrestlers tell stories of a chaotic, loud locker room going silent as Brody sat in the corner, fur boots on, chain at his feet, calmly reading the Journal's stock listings. This was not a stunt. Frank Goodish, the former journalist, was literally tracking his investments. He was terrified of the sight of older, broken-down wrestlers, men who were legends in their 40s, but were now, in their 50s, broke, in constant pain, and begging for a $50 payoff at a high school gym. He swore he would never be one of them. He was an intellectual playing a brute, a businessman disguised as a madman. This calculated chaos, this fragile balance between the artist and the CEO, finally came to a head in 1987. In a high-profile steel cage match in Florida, Brody was booked against Lex Luger. Luger was the promoter's new golden boy. He had an incredible physique, but in the ring, he was notoriously green and stiff. The script was simple. Brody, the established legend, was to pass the torch and make Luger look like a star. Brody did the unthinkable. From the moment the bell rang, he refused to cooperate. He just stood in the corner. Luger, confused, tried to engage. Brody no-sold everything. The match became a painfully awkward, silent standoff. The crowd grew restless, confused. The announcers were speechless. Then, in an unforgivable act of breaking the sport's sacred illusion, Brody simply stopped, looked at the referee, climbed out of the steel cage, and walked back to the locker room. He had quit in the middle of a main event. Why? The theories are numerous, and all point to the complex fortress of Frank Goodish. The first, as always, was money. It's rumored Brody discovered that Luger, the new star, was being paid more for the match than he was. To Brody, the man being asked to make the new star, this wasn't just a financial insult. It was a violation of the natural order. The unproven rookie could not make more than the legend. The second was professional contempt. Brody, for all his brawling, was a master ring psychologist. He likely saw Luger as just a body guy, a product of a gym who knew nothing of storytelling, who hadn't paid his dues on the long, lonely roads. The idea of sacrificing his own brand's invincibility for someone he didn't artistically respect was an offense he simply couldn't stomach. But the third theory, supported by his family, is the most tragic and human. By 1987, Frank Goodish was 41 years old. He was an aging warrior. His body, after nearly 15 years of a self-destructive, high-impact brawling style, was in constant, agonizing pain. Privately, he was suffering from severe anxiety. He was stressed about his finances, about his life after wrestling. He had spent his entire life building an invincible fortress around Bruiser Brody. And on that night in Florida, the wall cracked. It's possible Bruiser Brody didn't walk out. It was Frank Goodish, the tired, pained, and anxious man who simply couldn't wear the mask anymore. This incident made him toxic. Most American promoters who already saw him as a headache now saw him as a liability. His options, which he had always meticulously controlled, began to narrow. He became more reliant than ever on his lucrative foreign bookings, and this led him to take more and more dates in a territory that was notoriously chaotic, but also paid big money, Puerto Rico. At home, however, the monster ceased to exist. When Frank Goodish walked through his front door in Texas, Bruiser Brody disappeared. He was, by all accounts, a famously devoted and gentle father to his son Jeffrey, and a committed husband to his wife Barbara. The man who terrified thousands was, in private, an intelligent, quiet family man. All the violence, all the blood, all the hushed chants. It was just part of a demanding job, a character he played, a fortress he had built to provide for the people he loved. He was a walking contradiction, a loner who commanded respect, a businessman who bled for his money, and a father who played a monster. In the summer of 1988, this complex, brilliant, and increasingly cornered man packed his bags for another tour of Puerto Rico, unaware that his hard-earned reputation for being difficult had put him on a collision course with a local star and a system that would fail him completely. The island of Puerto Rico was a vital and volatile stop on the international wrestling circuit. The World Wrestling Council, run by the island's biggest star and national icon, Carlos Colon, was its beating heart. The territory was legendary and infamous for its hot crowds. This was a euphemism. The fans were a powder keg. They treated the storylines with a terrifying, passionate realism that blurred the lines between performance and reality to a dangerous degree. Fans regularly threw objects, not just cups, but batteries, rocks, and bottles. Wrestlers told stories of being stabbed by fans with shanks or cut with filed-down coins as they walked through the crowd. Attacks on wrestlers, particularly the hated American gringo villains, in the parking lot were commonplace. The style of wrestling was bloody. The kayfabe was absolute. And the local wrestlers were fiercely, violently protective of their house and their boys. The local police, often in attendance, were fans first and law enforcement second. Into this cauldron stepped Frank Goodish in July 1988. For Brody, this was in many ways just another business trip, but it was a trip he was taking under a dark cloud. His infamous walkout on Lex Luger in Florida had made him radioactive to most major U.S. promoters. While Japan remained his unshakable seven-figure bank, Puerto Rico had become an increasingly important high-paying supplement, but his reputation as a difficult, uncooperative businessman who protected his character at all costs had preceded him. In Puerto Rico, that reputation was a direct affront to the man who held the real power in the WWC locker room. Jose Huertas Gonzalez, known to the fans as Invader One, Gonzalez was not, on a global scale, a star. He was not on Brody's level, not even close. He was a popular but small mid-card wrestler. However, in Puerto Rico, he was a local hero. More importantly, he was a booker, one of the lead writers responsible for creating the storylines, deciding who won and lost. And even more importantly, he was a part owner of the company, deeply embedded financially and politically with Carlos Colon and the island's business structure. He was a man of immense local authority and, by all accounts, immense pride. The conflict that was brewing between the two men was not sudden. It was a perfect storm of professional tension, a clash of two iron wills. And it was about two things: money and respect. First, there was the money. Brody, the meticulous businessman, was not just a visiting talent. He was a business partner. He had invested, by some reports, as much as $40,000 as a part owner of WWC's fledgling expansion office in Houston, Texas, an attempt to bring the Puerto Rican brand to the mainland. The venture had failed, and it failed badly. Frank Goodish believed the San Juan office, specifically Colon and Gonzalez, owed him his money. He wasn't just coming to the island to perform, he was coming to collect. For Brody, this was a business meeting. For Gonzalez, a proud man being asked to pay a large debt to an outsider, it was an insult. Second, and perhaps more volatile, was the power struggle. Gonzalez, as the booker, had a job to do: create compelling television. It is widely understood that his creative plan for this tour involved a massive angle. He, Invader One, the local hero, was booked to finally get a decisive career-making victory over the unbeatable Bruiser Brody. This was a standard booking practice. The local hero vanquishes the monster, the crowd goes wild, and the territory thrives. But Bruiser Brody was not a standard monster. This was the man who had just walked out on a main event in Florida because he didn't respect his opponent, Lex Luger. The idea that he would do the job, a clean scripted loss for a Jose Gonzalez, a man who was physically half his size and whom Brody did not by any stretch consider to be in his league, was almost laughable. Frank Goodish would have seen it as a stupid, devaluing business decision. He would have, and almost certainly did, refuse. To Gonzalez, this refusal was a profound public and personal humiliation. It was a visiting American star who was already demanding money, now telling the boss and booker of the territory that he wasn't good enough to win a pretend fight in his own backyard. This clash of two proud, stubborn men, one protecting his global brand, the other protecting his local authority, created a toxic, explosive atmosphere. On July 16, 1988, that explosion came. The locker room at the Juan Ramon Lubriel Stadium in Bayamón was not a professional sports facility. It was a small, miserably hot, concrete-walled room packed with talent. Dutch Mantell, a respected veteran who was also on the card, later described the vibe as toxic and unbearably tense. There was a clear, visible divide. The American talent, Brody, Mantell, Tony Atlas, Dan Spivey, stuck together on one side of the room. The local Puerto Rican talent, Gonzalez, Colon, and the rest, were on the other. They weren't mixing. It was a tribal nationalistic standoff. The show was already underway. Wrestlers were coming in and out, the sound of the roaring, passionate crowd filtering in. Brody had been there for some time, likely in his Wall Street Journal mode, quiet and focused, waiting for his main event. Then, Jose Invader One Gonzalez entered the locker room. He didn't yell. He wasn't visibly enraged. According to witnesses, he was calm. He walked over to Brody, who was sitting on a bench. He spoke to him in a low, quiet voice. He asked Brody to come with him to the shower area, the only place in the loud, cramped room where one could have a semi-private conversation. It was the back office. Brody, likely assuming this was the time for the final tense financial negotiation or the last argument about the night's finish, agreed. He stood up, his 6 feet 8-inch frame towering over Gonzalez, and followed him into the small, tiled-off shower and bathroom area, disappearing from the view of most of the room. What happened next is a blur of conflicting accounts, but the core facts are chilling and undisputed. The other wrestlers continued their routines, taping their wrists, lacing their boots, the noise of the arena providing a backdrop. Seconds passed, maybe a minute. Then came the screams. They were not kayfabe screams. They were not part of the show. They were high-pitched, agonizing, guttural sounds of pure, primal pain. Dutch Mantell, who was sitting close by, heard them. He later recalled that his first insane thought was that someone was playing a prank, a rib. It was so horrible, so out of place, it couldn't possibly be real. 2 distinct, harrowing screams, and then a different sound, a heavy, sickening thud. Frank Goodish stumbled out of the shower area, back into the main locker room. He didn't charge out. He staggered. He was clutching his abdomen with both hands. His hands were already slick with his own blood. He collapsed to the dirty concrete floor. The locker room froze. The music, the crowd noise, the conversations. Everything stopped. Tony Atlas, a mountain of a man and one of the most powerful wrestlers in the business, was one of the first to react. He looked at Brody on the floor, then charged towards the shower area to see what had happened. Atlas has stated in multiple interviews and under oath that as he rounded the corner, he saw Jose Gonzalez standing there, holding a long, bloody knife. The 2 men locked eyes. Atlas, in a state of shock and rage, demanded to know what Gonzalez had done. Gonzalez reportedly just stared back. Chaos erupted. The American wrestlers, led by Atlas and Mantell, rushed to Brody's side. The local wrestlers, according to the Americans' accounts, did something chilling. They formed a wall. They grouped around Gonzalez, seemingly shielding him, and stared down the Americans. The room was now divided, not as performers, but as 2 warring tribal factions. On the floor, Bruiser Brody was dying. He had been stabbed twice, deeply in the abdomen. The blade had sliced through his liver and other vital organs. He was bleeding profusely, internally and externally, creating a growing pool on the concrete. He was going into shock, but his mind, the sharp analytical mind of Frank Goodish, was still working. He knew exactly what was happening. Dutch Mantell knelt beside his friend. He tried to apply pressure to offer comfort, but he knew it was hopeless. He would later, tearfully, recount Brody's final lucid words. Brody, gasping for air, his voice already weak, looked up at Mantell. "Watch my baby," he managed to say, referring to his young son Jeffrey. He struggled to get the next words out. "Tell my wife I love her." This was the moment the monster died. The CEO was gone. The brawler, the brand, the intellectual, they all evaporated. All that was left was Frank Goodish, a father and a husband, bleeding to death on a filthy locker room floor, his last thoughts on the family he had built his entire brutal career to protect. And then the true horror began. The wait. The call for an ambulance was made, but no ambulance came. Minutes stretched into an agonizing eternity. 10 minutes, 20, 30. The stadium was in a busy urban area, not a remote field. Paramedics were supposedly on site for the event, but they were nowhere to be found. The wrestlers were screaming for help, for a doctor, for anyone, but their pleas were met with a shrug of incompetence, or, as many of them believe to this day, a deliberate, sinister delay. For nearly 45 minutes, by most witness accounts, Bruiser Brody lay on that floor, conscious for much of it, bleeding out. The other Americans felt utterly, profoundly helpless, trapped in a foreign land, surrounded by a local contingent that had closed ranks and seemed to them to be callously indifferent. While this agonizing wait was happening, another darker event was allegedly taking place. Savio Vega, a young Puerto Rican wrestler then known as TNT, was in the locker room. He was not part of the main event clique. He was a local boy, terrified, staying back and watching. Decades later, on Vice TV's Dark Side of the Ring, he recounted his chilling memory of the immediate aftermath. Vega claims he saw another wrestler quietly move to where the knife had been dropped. He watched this person pick up the weapon, walk to the adjacent bathroom stalls, and then he heard the distinct sound of a toilet flushing. Twice. The murder weapon, the single most important piece of evidence in the case, was, he alleges, disposed of before the police had even arrived. The cover-up, it seems, began before the victim had even left the room. When the ambulance crew finally arrived, their initial efforts were described as shockingly inept. They were reportedly not equipped to handle a man of Brody's immense size, struggling to lift him, and they seemed unaware of the severity of the wounds. He was loaded onto a gurney and taken on the long, agonizing ride to the hospital. Frank Goodish was alive when he left the stadium. He made it to the hospital. He made it to the operating table, but the damage was too severe. The combination of the deep, devastating wounds and the catastrophic, irreversible blood loss from the 45-minute delay had given him no chance. In the early hours of July 17, 1988, Frank Donald Goodish died. He was 42 years old. The news spread through the wrestling world like a shockwave. The Central Intelligence Agency had ceased to be a mere arm of the executive branch. It had metastasized into a secular priesthood, and Allen Dulles was its infallible pope. From his office in Langley, surrounded by the maps of nations he had broken and remade, Dulles viewed the world not as a dynamic, chaotic place, but as a chessboard, where he alone understood the rules. He had toppled Mossadegh in Iran with a checkbook. He had chased Arbenz out of Guatemala with a radio transmitter. He had grown addicted to the drug of the easy win. But addiction creates a tolerance, and tolerance leads to recklessness. The spymaster was about to encounter a variable he could not manipulate, a problem that could not be solved with a bribe or a whisper. That problem was an island shaped like a crocodile, floating 90 miles off the coast of Florida. To Allen Dulles, Fidel Castro was not just a communist dictator, he was a theological error. Castro's survival was a personal affront to the Dulles doctrine, which held that the Western Hemisphere was the private property of the United States and its corporations. When Castro seized power in 1959 and began nationalizing American sugar plantations and casinos, he wasn't just seizing assets, he was seizing the narrative. He was proving that a small nation could defy the giant and survive. For a man like Dulles, whose entire worldview was built on the projection of irresistible American power, this was intolerable. Castro became Dulles's consuming obsession, a fixation that would drive the agency into a moral abyss from which it would never fully recover. The campaign against Cuba began in the shadows, with a series of plots so bizarre they read like the fever dreams of a pulp novelist. This was Operation Mongoose, a program where the sophisticated Ivy League intellects of the CIA descended into the realm of the grotesque. Under Dulles's oversight, the agency's technical services division concocted schemes to humiliate or kill the Cuban leader. They designed cigars packed with explosives. They tried to dust his shoes with thallium salts to make his famous beard fall out, hoping to strip him of his machismo. They forged plans to paint a U.S. submarine with the image of Jesus Christ to surface off the coast of Havana, hoping to spark a religious uprising. But the darkest chapter of this obsession was the unholy alliance Dulles sanctioned between the CIA and the Mafia. In his desperate desire to remove Castro, Dulles authorized the agency to reach out to the very criminals the FBI was trying to destroy. The CIA contacted figures like Sam Giancana and Santos Traficante, mob bosses who had lost their lucrative Havana casinos to the revolution. The deal was simple. The CIA would provide the poison pills and the intelligence. The mafia would provide the hitmen. It was the ultimate expression of Dulles's philosophy that the ends justify the means. He was willing to partner with murderers to save democracy. The irony was suffocating, but Dulles was immune to irony. He saw himself as a man making the hard choices that lesser men, politicians and voters, were too weak to make. When the assassination plots failed to materialize, Dulles returned to the playbook that had served him so well in 1954. He decided to replay the Guatemala script. He would recruit an army of disaffected Cuban exiles, train them in the swamps of Central America, arm them with American weapons, and unleash them on the beaches of Cuba. He believed, with a religious fervor, that the moment the exiles landed, the Cuban people would rise up and overthrow the tyrant. He believed this because he needed to believe it. The echo chamber at Langley, filled with yes-men who knew better than to contradict the director, reinforced the delusion. They ignored the intelligence reports that said Castro was popular. They ignored the fact that the Cuban army was battle-hardened. They were planning an invasion based on nostalgia for a victory they had won 7 years ago in a different country against a different enemy. But the clock was ticking. In November 1960, John F. Kennedy was elected president. The torch was being passed from the grandfatherly Eisenhower to a dynamic, skeptical young man who read dossiers with a critical eye. Dulles viewed Kennedy with a mixture of condescension and opportunity. He saw a young, inexperienced leader who could be managed, a student who needed the guidance of the professor. The briefing Dulles gave to the president-elect regarding the invasion plan was a masterclass in manipulation. He sold Kennedy on a slam dunk. He painted a picture of a quiet, low-risk infiltration that would spark a spontaneous uprising. He invoked the ghost of Guatemala. He assured Kennedy that the U.S. military would not need to be involved, knowing full well that Kennedy's greatest fear was being dragged into a visible war that would alienate the Soviet Union. Dulles lied by omission. He did not tell Kennedy the one thing that his own military analysts knew to be true. Without direct American air support and arguably a Marine landing, the exile force would be slaughtered. This is the trap that Allen Dulles set for the President of the United States. It is the central historical argument of the Bay of Pigs disaster. Dulles knew the invasion force was too small. He knew the uprising was a fantasy. So why did he push for it? Because he assumed that once the men were on the beach, once the shooting started, and the exiles were pinned down, the young president would panic. He believed Kennedy would be forced by the logic of the situation to send in the aircraft carriers to save them. Dulles was gambling with human lives, betting that Kennedy would rather start a war than suffer a humiliation. He was trying to force the president's hand to commit the United States to a conflict it did not want. On April 17, 1961, the trap was sprung. Brigade 2506, the force of Cuban exiles, landed at the Bay of Pigs. From the first moment, the operation was a catastrophe. The secret invasion had been leaked in newspapers for weeks. Castro was waiting. The Cuban Air Force, which the CIA promised would be destroyed on the ground, was airborne and strafing the beaches. The supply ships were sunk. The paratroopers were blown off course. In Washington, the atmosphere in the White House Situation Room shifted from anxiety to horror. The reports coming in were dire. The exiles were trapped against the sea, running out of ammunition, screaming for the air umbrella they had been promised. Dulles was not in Washington when the disaster began. In a bizarre move, he had kept a speaking engagement in Puerto Rico, perhaps to create plausible deniability, leaving his subordinates to manage the chaos. But when he returned, the dynamic he had anticipated began to play out. The CIA and the military brass pressured Kennedy. "Mr. President, you must send in the planes. You cannot let these men die." But Allen Dulles had miscalculated the character of John F. Kennedy. Kennedy realized with a cold fury that he had been lied to. He realized he had been boxed into a corner by his own intelligence chief, and he refused to take the bait. He famously declared that he would rather be called an aggressor than a liar, but in this moment he chose to be called a coward rather than start World War III. He refused to authorize the airstrikes. He refused to send in the Marines. He let the operation fail. For Dulles, this was inconceivable. A president who accepted defeat, a president who left assets to be captured, it shattered his understanding of how power worked. The old boy network had failed. The exiles surrendered. Over 100 were killed. More than 1,000 were taken prisoner. Castro went on television to mock the imperialist mercenaries. The United States had suffered its greatest humiliation of the Cold War. The aftermath of the Bay of Pigs was the funeral of the Dulles mystique. The veil of invincibility that had shrouded the CIA for a decade was ripped away. The public saw an agency that was incompetent, reckless, and out of control. Kennedy was publicly responsible. He went on TV and accepted the blame, but privately, he was incandescent with rage. He told his aides he wanted to splinter the CIA into 1,000 pieces and scatter it to the winds. The relationship between the president and the spy master was dead. Kennedy could no longer trust the man who sat in the director's chair. The establishment, that club of elite men who believed they owned the government, had been rebuked. Kennedy initiated an inquiry that exposed the shoddy planning, the groupthink, and the arrogance that had led to the disaster. In November 1961, the end came. It was handled with the polite fiction of Washington protocol. There was a ceremony at the new CIA headquarters in Langley, a building Dulles had built. Kennedy awarded Dulles the National Security Medal. He praised his distinguished service and his patriotism, but everyone in the room, from the generals to the field agents, knew what was happening. It was a firing. It was an eviction. Allen Dulles, the man who had reshaped the world map, the man who had treated nations like poker chips, was being put out to pasture. He was 68 years old. He shuffled out of the building he had designed, his pipe in his hand, into the cold November air. He was leaving behind an agency that was demoralized and under siege. He believed his life's work was over. He believed he would fade into history as the man who lost Cuba. But history has a way of dragging its ghosts back onto the stage. Dulles retired to write his memoirs and nurse his grievances, believing he was done with public life. He did not know that the darkest chapter of his service to the state was yet to come. 2 years later, a rifle shot in Dallas would shatter the peace of the nation and the man whom Kennedy had fired would be called back to investigate the death of the man who fired him. The fox was about to be invited back to guard the henhouse, and the secrets of the CIA would be buried in the grave of the president. The door to power had slammed shut, or so it seemed. But in the shadow world Allen Dulles inhabited, no exit is ever truly final. While the public believed the old man had faded into history, the machinery he built continued to grind on, creating a destiny that would inextricably link his fate to the tragedy of the man who had dismissed him. The stage was being set for a final macabre encore. one where the accused would become the judge and the architect of the deep state would be called upon to whitewash its greatest failure. The exile of a spy master is a strange purgatory, a silence filled with the ghosts of secrets that can no longer be told. When Allen Dulles walked out of the CIA headquarters in November 1961, stripped of his badge and his title by a young president who felt betrayed, he did not retreat into the quiet obscurity of the golf course. He retreated to his brick mansion in Georgetown, turning his library into a government in exile. Though he no longer held the scepter, the priesthood still looked to him for blessing. Agents would stop by for drinks. Journalists would call for background. He remained the spiritual father of the agency, brooding over his dismissal, writing a memoir titled The Craft of Intelligence that was less a history and more a defense of his life's work. He watched from the sidelines as John F. Kennedy tried to wrestle the massive, unruly intelligence apparatus back under executive control, viewing the president's efforts not as reform, but as a dangerous weakening of the nation's immune system. To Dulles, presidents were temporary employees. The agency was eternal. But history has a wicked sense of irony, and it was about to drag the old man back onto the stage for a final grotesque act. On November 22, 1963, the shots rang out in Dallas. The motorcade sped away. The president was dead. The nation was plunged into a trauma so deep it threatened to tear the social fabric apart. Rumors swirled instantly. Was it the Soviets? The Cubans? The CIA itself? In the chaotic days that followed, the new president, Lyndon B. Johnson, realized he needed to seal the narrative. He needed a commission to investigate the assassination, but more importantly, he needed a commission that would put the public's fears to rest. He needed men of unimpeachable stature, men of the establishment. And so in one of the most staggering conflicts of interest in the history of jurisprudence, LBJ picked up the phone and called the man whom Kennedy had fired. He asked Allen Dulles to serve on the Warren Commission. Dulles accepted immediately. To the public, this looked like the act of a patriotic elder statesman stepping up in a crisis. But to those who knew the dark geography of the secret world, it was the fox being invited back to guard the henhouse. Allen Dulles did not join the Warren Commission to find the truth. He joined it to bury the bodies. From the very first meeting of the commission, Dulles established himself not as an investigator, but as a gatekeeper. He was the most active member of the panel. While Chief Justice Earl Warren was a figurehead often distracted by his Supreme Court duties, and the other senators were busy with politics, Dulles was there every day. He read every file. He interviewed every witness. He guided the staff lawyers with the gentle, firm hand of a grandfather, teaching a child to play chess. But his goal was not checkmate. His goal was a stalemate. The terrifying secret that Dulles carried into that hearing room, the secret that, if revealed, could have ignited World War III, was the CIA's obsession with assassinating Fidel Castro. Dulles knew, because he had authorized it, that the agency had spent years trying to kill the Cuban leader, often in partnership with the mafia. He knew that the agency had been running operations against Cuba right up until the moment Kennedy was shot. If the American public learned that the CIA had been trying to kill a foreign head of state, they might conclude that Oswald was a retaliatory agent sent by Havana, or that the assassination was blowback for American crimes. Such a revelation would force the United States to invade Cuba, drawing the Soviet Union into a nuclear exchange. So Allen Dulles made a command decision. He would protect the agency at the expense of the truth. He would lie to the Chief Justice. He would lie to the American people. He would lie to history. Throughout the investigation, whenever the trail of evidence veered too close to the CIA's dirty laundry, Dulles steered it away. When rumors surfaced that Lee Harvey Oswald might have been an FBI informant or a CIA asset, Dulles privately assured the other commissioners that such things were impossible, relying on his reputation to silence the questions. He carefully curated the documents the CIA released to the commission. He ensured that the plots against Castro were never mentioned in the final report. He crafted a narrative of the lone nut, a solitary, deranged gunman acting out of personal malice, unconnected to the great gears of geopolitics. It was his masterpiece of tradecraft. He managed to contain the most explosive event of the century within a neat, tidy box. He viewed this not as a crime, but as a final act of service to the state. In his mind, the stability of the republic depended on the people believing that their institutions were innocent. He was the good shepherd, protecting the flock from the wolves of reality, even if he had to deceive the flock to do it. But the strain of maintaining the lie, combined with the creeping advance of age, began to take its toll. After the Warren Report was published in 1964, Dulles began to fade. The sharp, Harvard-trained intellect that had outwitted Nazis and toppled governments began to cloud with dementia. The spy master was losing his grip on the files in his own mind. As the 1960s spiraled into the chaos of Vietnam, the civil rights movement, and the counterculture, the world that Allen Dulles had built began to crack. A new generation of journalists and activists began to ask the questions that had been forbidden in the 1950s. In 1967, Ramparts magazine broke the story that the CIA had been secretly funding student groups and cultural organizations for decades. The veil of secrecy was being ripped away. The agency, once revered as a knighthood of freedom, was increasingly viewed as a sinister, rogue elephant. Dulles watched this unraveling with confusion and horror. To him, the transparency demanded by the 1960s was a form of suicide. He could not understand a world where the government was expected to tell the truth to its citizens. He belonged to a time of gentlemen's agreements and smoke-filled rooms, a time when the elite ruled by right of birth and breeding. He spent his final years in a twilight of paranoia, mumbling about the communists, believing that the dissent in the streets was a Soviet plot, unable to see that the anger was homegrown, a reaction to the very world he had helped create. He died on January 29, 1969, of influenza complicated by pneumonia. He was 75 years old. He died just months before the full scale of the CIA's domestic spying operations and assassination plots would be revealed to the public in the church committee hearings of the 1970s. He escaped the final judgment of the Senate. He took his secrets to the grave, buried in the Green Mount Cemetery in Baltimore. But a man like Allen Dulles does not truly die as long as his architecture remains. And the architecture he built is the world we live in today. When we look at the legacy of the spy master of the American century, we are confronted with a terrifying paradox. Allen Dulles was a man of immense charm, culture, and patriotism. He loved his country. He believed he was saving Western civilization from a barbaric totalitarianism. He was a devoted father, a lover of art, a man who could quote poetry while ordering a coup. But he was also the man who taught America that it could be an empire while pretending to be a republic. He was the architect of the deep state, not in the conspiratorial sense of a cabal, but in the structural sense of a permanent, unelected bureaucracy that operates outside the law. He normalized the idea that the president can order death from a distance. He normalized the idea that national security justifies the suspension of morality. He normalized the idea that the citizens are children who must be protected from the truth by a father figure in a tweed coat. From the torture chambers of the Shah's Iran to the death squads of Guatemala, from the LSD experiments on unwitting Canadians to the botched invasion of Cuba, the fingerprints of Alan Dulles are smeared across the second half of the 20th century. He proved that the road to hell is not just paved with good intentions, it is paved with dossiers, secret handshakes, and the absolute terrifying conviction that the rules are for other people. In the end, the story of Alan Dulles is a ghost story. It is the story of a democracy that made a deal with the devil in the panicked days of the Cold War. It traded its soul for security. It traded its transparency for power. And Alan Dulles was the broker of that deal. He stands there still in the shadow of history, pipe in hand, a faint ironic smile on his lips, reminding us that the monsters we fear are often the ones we created to protect us. He built the machine, and long after the maker has turned to dust, the machine is still running.